History is full of ideas that once made perfect sense. We are about to journey through 25 of the most bizarre beliefs from our past, concepts that seemed utterly logical to our ancestors, but now appear completely absurd. You will discover the strange theories that shaped societies, influenced medicine, and even guided exploration for centuries. What did people once think caused disease, and why did they put animals on trial in a court of law? By the end of this, you will see just how dramatically our understanding of the world can change. What do you think our modern world holds that future generations will laugh at? For centuries, doctors and city planners operated under a single, powerful assumption. The very air you breathed could be poisoned, carrying sickness on an invisible wind. This was the Miasma Theory, the idea that diseases like cholera and the Black Death were caused by bad air. This foul miasma was thought to rise from swamps, from piles of rotting garbage, and from the unclean conditions of crowded cities. It was a smell you could detect, and so people reasoned it was the smell itself that made you ill. This belief fundamentally shaped the world. It drove massive public works projects designed to clear away the stench. Cities built elaborate sewer systems not to kill germs, which were unknown, but to vent the poisonous odors. Wide boulevards were planned to allow fresh air to circulate and blow the bad air away. This theory even gave us the haunting image of the plague doctor, his long beak-like mask stuffed with fragrant herbs and spices. The logic was simple: to filter out the miasma with a wall of pleasant scents before it could reach the doctor's lungs. Can you imagine the dedication, trying to fight a horrific disease with little more than a potpourri-filled mask? The persistence of this idea for hundreds of years makes a strange kind of sense. People could see the correlation between filthy, foul-smelling areas and outbreaks of disease. They had no concept of microscopic organisms, so the evidence of their own senses seemed undeniable. The real tragedy is that this well-intentioned fight against bad air did lead to cleaner cities, which accidentally helped somewhat, all while the true culprits, bacteria and viruses, spread unnoticed in the very water and food people consumed. This obsession with foul air had a profound and contradictory legacy. On one hand, it spurred a monumental push for urban sanitation. Cities across Europe embarked on massive projects to remove waste, install sewers, and create open parks, all in an effort to clear the miasmatic haze. These efforts, while based on a flawed premise, did have the positive side effect of making cities cleaner and slightly healthier places to live. Yet this very success also became a trap, reinforcing the belief in bad air and blinding the medical establishment to the real enemy. The tragic irony is that while officials were busy cleansing the air, people were dying from something in the water. This conflict came to a dramatic head in London in 1854 during a devastating cholera outbreak. A doctor named John Snow began mapping the cases, and a chilling pattern emerged. The disease was not spreading randomly through the air. It was clustering terrifyingly around a single water pump on Broad Street. Snow's findings pointed directly to contaminated water as the source, a direct challenge to the miasma theory. He famously had the handle of that Broad Street pump removed, and the outbreak in that immediate area subsided. Yet, even with this compelling evidence, the establishment was skeptical. The idea of invisible germs in water was too radical, too at odds with what people could see and smell. The powerful hold of miasma theory delayed the widespread acceptance of germ theory for decades, costing countless lives because the answer did not fit the prevailing narrative. It is a stark reminder that sometimes the most deeply held beliefs can be the very things that prevent us from seeing the truth right in front of us. While doctors were battling bad air, natural philosophers were grappling with an even more fundamental question. Where did life itself come from? For nearly 2,000 years, the accepted answer was spontaneous generation, the belief that life could simply spring forth from non-living matter. It was a concept championed by the great Aristotle himself, who taught that fleas emerged from dust, that lice were born from human sweat, and that mice could be generated from piles of dirty hay. This idea was not merely an ancient Greek curiosity. It was a cornerstone of biological thought, a seemingly logical explanation for the sudden appearance of maggots on rotting meat or fungi on a damp piece of bread. People saw life emerging from what appeared to be inert material, and without the knowledge of eggs or microorganisms, the conclusion seemed obvious. Life was a property of matter itself, activated by the right conditions like heat or decay. Can you picture the world through that lens, where a piece of cheese could simply give birth to a swarm of flies? This belief was so deeply ingrained that it went largely unchallenged for centuries. It explained the seemingly random appearance of pests and parasites, fitting neatly into a worldview where nature was constantly creating life from the elements. But this comfortable assumption was about to be tested. In the 17th century, an Italian physician named Francesco Riddi decided to put the idea to the test with a brilliantly simple experiment. He placed meat in several jars, leaving some open to the air and covering others with fine gauze. The open jars were soon teeming with maggots, but the covered jars, despite the meat rotting and smelling just as foul, remained completely free of them. The maggots only appeared where flies could land and lay their eggs. Riddi had demonstrated that life did not spontaneously generate from the meat, it came from other life. Yet the scientific community was not ready to let go of the idea entirely. With the invention of the microscope, a new world of microorganisms was discovered, and the debate flared up again. Surely, these tiny creatures were so simple they must arise spontaneously from broth or water. It took the meticulous work of Louis Pasteur in the 19th century to deliver the final blow. Pasteur designed his famous swan neck flasks, filled them with a nutrient-rich broth, and boiled them. The long, curved necks of the flasks allowed air to enter but trapped any dust or microbes, preventing them from reaching the sterile liquid. The broth remained perfectly clear and free of life indefinitely. Only when he broke the neck, allowing contaminated dust to fall in, did the broth quickly cloud with microbial growth. Pasteur had proven, once and for all, that even the smallest forms of life come only from pre-existing life. His experiment dismantled a 2,000-year-old belief, paving the way for the modern science of microbiology and fundamentally changing our understanding of life's origins. The idea that our ancestors universally believed in a flat Earth is itself a modern misconception. Ancient Greek philosophers, sailors who watched ships disappear hull first over the horizon, and scholars across numerous cultures had long since deduced our world was a sphere. Yet a persistent myth took root in the 19th century, a bizarre historical belief manufactured not in the Dark Ages but in the age of industry. The man most responsible for this was an English inventor named Samuel Robotham. He began promoting a new, radical theory he called zetetic astronomy, which posited the Earth was not a globe, but a flat, disc-like plane with the North Pole at its center and a wall of ice, Antarctica, encircling the edge. He argued the Sun and Moon were only a few thousand miles away and moved in a circle above the disk, creating the illusion of sunrise and sunset. Robotham was a charismatic and skilled debater who published pamphlets and gave public lectures, using simple, seemingly common-sense experiments to convince his audiences. He would point to a stationary boat on a calm canal and claim that if the Earth were truly curved, the distant vessel should be partially hidden from view, a phenomenon his followers claimed they could not see. Of course, these experiments deliberately ignored the complex effects of atmospheric refraction, but to the untrained eye, his logic appeared sound. His ideas found a receptive audience among certain religious groups who interpreted biblical passages literally, and they grew into a surprisingly robust movement. After Robotham's death, his followers even established a universal zetetic society, complete with its own journal, dedicated to proving the world was flat. This movement, though always on the fringes, never truly died out. It is a strange twist of history, a belief that feels ancient but was actually born in an era of steamships and telegraphs, a reminder that absurd ideas can be constructed with modern tools and persuasive showmanship, creating a mystery where science had long since provided the answer. While the shape of the Earth was being debated, the inner workings of the human body were governed by a system that seemed just as logical to its practitioners. For nearly 2,000 years, Western medicine was built upon the humoral theory, a concept developed by the ancient Greeks. This idea proposed that our health and even our personality were determined by 4 vital fluids or humors flowing within us. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to a specific element and a set of qualities. Blood was associated with air and was considered hot and moist. Phlegm connected to water was cold and moist. Yellow bile tied to fire was hot and dry, and the mysterious black bile linked to earth was cold and dry. A person was believed to be healthy when these 4 humors were in perfect, harmonious balance. Sickness, in this worldview, was simply a state of imbalance. If you had a fever that was an excess of the hot qualities, perhaps too much blood or yellow bile. If you were lethargic and congested, that pointed to a surplus of cold, moist phlegm. This framework did not just diagnose illness, it defined human nature. A person with a dominance of blood was thought to be sanguine, cheerful, and passionate. Someone with too much phlegm was phlegmatic, calm, and unemotional. An excess of yellow bile created a choleric personality, easily angered and ambitious. And an abundance of black bile led to a melancholic disposition, prone to sadness and introspection. Can you see how this created an entire medical and psychological map of humanity, all based on 4 invisible fluids? The treatments developed from this belief were as systematic as the diagnosis. To cure an illness, a doctor had to restore the body's natural balance. This logic led to some of history's most enduring and gruesome medical practices. If a patient had a fever, an excess of heat and blood, the obvious cure was bloodletting. A surgeon would open a vein, often draining pints of blood to cool the patient down and reduce the sanguine humor. For an ailment thought to be caused by too much phlegm or black bile, a doctor might induce violent purging through emetics or laxatives. Dietary changes were also prescribed to counteract the dominant humor. A phlegmatic person, already cold and moist, would be advised to avoid cold, wet foods like fish and dairy, and instead eat hot, dry meals made with plenty of spices. These practices were not the work of ignorant barbarians. They were the standard of care performed by the most educated physicians for centuries. The system was beautifully self-contained and internally consistent, explaining every symptom and prescribing a clear, if brutal, path to wellness. It was a medical philosophy so complete that it resisted challenge until the slow, painstaking rise of modern science began to reveal what was truly flowing through our veins. But the logic of the humors extended far beyond the human body, seeping into the very halls of justice. In medieval Europe, the legal system operated on a principle of universal order, a belief that all of creation, human and animal alike, was subject to the same divine laws. This led to one of history's most peculiar legal practices, the formal trial of animals. Communities did not merely exterminate pests or slaughter a dangerous beast, they brought them to court. These were not symbolic proceedings, they were full legal trials, complete with appointed defense lawyers, prosecutors, sworn witnesses, and a judge who would deliver a sentence. The records are startlingly detailed. A sow and her piglets could be tried for the murder of an infant, a herd of weevils prosecuted for destroying a vineyard, or a colony of rats charged with stealing grain. The animals were treated as morally responsible beings, capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong and of committing crimes with malicious intent. Can you envision the scene, a pig being dressed in human clothes and led into a courtroom to stand trial for murder? One of the most famous cases involved a sow in the French town of Falaise in the 14th century. The animal had mauled and killed a child and was subsequently put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to public execution. The sentence was carried out with a chilling formality. The sow was dressed in a waistcoat and gloves, mutilated, and then hanged in the public square. This was not an isolated incident. In Switzerland, a mother hen was put on trial for the unnatural crime of laying an egg, which was considered a sign of the devil. The court, after hearing arguments from a defense attorney, ultimately acquitted the hen, deciding the evidence was insufficient. Even insects were not beyond the reach of the law. In a case from the 16th century, the villagers of Saint Julien de Maurienne brought a lawsuit against a plague of weevils destroying their crops. The community hired a lawyer to defend the insects, arguing that they were simply following their God-given nature to eat and survive. The court initially granted the weevils their own piece of land to live on, but when the insects continued to ravage the vineyards, a second trial was held, and they were formally excommunicated from the church, a sentence meant to drive them away through spiritual force. The philosophical reasoning behind these trials reveals a medieval world grappling with chaos. If an animal could disrupt the social order by committing a crime, then the entire cosmic order was at risk. The trial was a ritual to restore that balance, to publicly condemn the transgression and cleanse the community of the spiritual stain. It was a way for society to assert control over the unpredictable and often terrifying forces of nature, using the familiar tool of law to confront the unknown. This bizarre practice shows us a world where the line between human and beast was far more blurred, and where justice was a cosmic force that had to be appeased no matter the defendant. This same belief in a divinely ordered world expressed itself in the medicine of the time through a principle known as the Doctrine of Signatures. It was a powerful and intuitive idea that God had left his mark on nature, a kind of botanical code for humanity to decipher. If a plant, root, or herb bore a resemblance to a part of the human body, then that was a clear sign from the Creator of its intended purpose. A plant that looked like a liver must be meant to treat liver ailments. One that resembled a kidney was the cure for kidney stones. This was not seen as mere coincidence, but as a deliberate act of divine labeling. Can you imagine walking through a forest and seeing it not just as a collection of plants, but as a vast open-air pharmacy, each herb holding a visual clue to its healing power? The examples are as fascinating as they are literal. The walnut, encased in its hard skull-like shell and containing a nut that folds into two hemispheres, was seen as the perfect remedy for head ailments and brain health. Lungwort, a plant with leaves spotted and textured like a diseased lung, was universally prescribed for tuberculosis and other respiratory illnesses. The vibrant red sap of the bloodroot plant was used to treat blood disorders, while the twisted, stone-like appearance of the roots of the saxifrage plant, whose name literally means stone breaker, made it the go-to cure for kidney stones and gallstones. This belief system provided a framework for herbalists and healers for centuries, offering a logical, faith-based guide to the natural world. It gave people a sense of control and understanding, a way to navigate the terrifying uncertainty of illness with a map they believed was drawn by God himself. The Doctrine of Signatures was more than just medical practice. It was a form of theology, a way of reading the purpose and benevolence of the Creator in every leaf and petal. Yet, for all its intuitive appeal, this botanical faith was ultimately a flawed guide. While some plants identified by the doctrine did have genuine medicinal properties, it was a result of their chemical makeup, not their appearance. Many others were completely ineffective or even dangerously toxic. The eventual rise of scientific botany and chemistry in the 17th and 18th centuries began to systematically dismantle the idea. Researchers started to isolate the active compounds within plants, discovering that a plant's healing power had no correlation to its shape or color. The doctrine was dismissed as superstition, a well-intentioned but ultimately misguided attempt to find patterns where none existed. It is a poignant example of how our desire to see a purposeful, designed world can sometimes lead us to conclusions that feel right but are built on a foundation of mere resemblance. Just as people believed they could read divine purpose in the shape of a leaf, another society became convinced they could find immense wealth in the heart of a flower. In the Netherlands of the 1600s, a simple tulip bulb was transformed from a garden ornament into an object of wild financial speculation. This was Tulip Mania, a period where the collective belief in the intrinsic value of a flower created one of history's first and most dramatic economic bubbles. It began with a genuine rarity. Tulips were a relatively new import from the Ottoman Empire, and a virus known as the mosaic virus would sometimes infect the bulbs, causing the petals to develop spectacular, flame-like streaks of color. These broken tulips, as they were called, were unpredictable and impossible to replicate through normal planting. A single, unique bulb could be a one-of-a-kind natural masterpiece, and that scarcity fueled an initial, understandable desire among the wealthy to own them. But this desire soon mutated into a national obsession. At the peak of the mania around 1636 and 1637, the prices for the most coveted bulbs spiraled into pure fantasy. A single bulb of the prized Semper Augustus tulip could sell for more than a luxurious canal-side house in Amsterdam. Historical records show transactions where a single bulb was traded for a dozen acres of farmland, for a fleet of ships, or for a sum of money that could feed a working-class family for a lifetime. Can you fathom trading your home, the single most valuable thing you own, for something that would fit in the palm of your hand and only bloom for a week each spring? The entire structure of Dutch society was swept up in the frenzy. Not just wealthy merchants, but also craftsmen, farmers, and servants began trading in tulip contracts, using their life savings to buy a piece of this floral promise. They were not buying the flowers themselves, but futures contracts, promises to buy bulbs at a set price at the end of the growing season. People truly believed the value could only go up, that there would always be a richer buyer willing to pay an even more outrageous sum. Taverns became impromptu trading floors, and ordinary people saw neighbors become paper millionaires overnight, fueling the belief that this was a new, permanent reality. The entire economy was being propped up by a collective agreement that these bulbs were priceless, an agreement as fragile as the flower itself. The crash, when it came, was as swift as it was inevitable. In early 1637, at a routine auction in the city of Haarlem, a batch of bulbs failed to sell. A flicker of doubt spread through the crowd. If no one was buying today, what did that mean for the value of everything they owned? Panic set in almost instantly. Within days, the market collapsed completely. People who had signed contracts to buy bulbs for the price of a mansion were now legally bound to pay for something that was suddenly worth no more than an onion. The courts were flooded with lawsuits, but there was no money to be had. Fortunes vanished overnight, and the Dutch economy was plunged into a severe crisis. The mania evaporated, leaving behind only the stark realization of the absurdity. The tulip bulbs were still just tulip bulbs. They were beautiful, but they could not house a family, they could not feed a village, and their spectacular value existed only as long as everyone believed it did. The entire episode was a powerful, painful lesson in the difference between price and true worth, a lesson taught not by economists but by a flower. Long after the tulip fields returned to normal, a far more enduring idea continued to shape the entire Western world. The universe itself was built from just 4 fundamental ingredients: earth, air, fire, and water. These were the essential elements proposed by the Greek philosopher Empedocles and later championed by Aristotle. This was not merely a list of substances, it was a complete cosmological system. Every single thing in existence, from a mountain to a human being, from a burning log to a gust of wind, was believed to be a unique mixture of these four primal essences. The physical properties of everything were explained through their balance. A rock was dominated by the element of earth, solid and heavy. A river was mostly water, fluid and cool. A flame was pure fire, hot and transformative. The air you breathed was the element of air, light and invisible. This elegant system provided a powerful, all-encompassing answer to the mystery of matter. It explained why wood, when burned, turned to smoke, which was air, and left behind ash, which was earth. It was a transformation of elements, not a destruction of matter. This framework extended far beyond simple physics, deeply infiltrating medicine and psychology. The four humors of the body were directly linked to the four elements. Blood was hot and moist like air, phlegm was cold and moist like water, yellow bile was hot and dry like fire, and black bile was cold and dry like earth. Your entire temperament was therefore a reflection of the cosmic elements swirling within you. Even the movements of the heavens were tied to this quartet. Aristotle proposed a fifth element, the ether, for the perfect and immutable stars, but the four classical elements governed the ever-changing sublunar world, the realm of life and decay. For nearly 2,000 years, this model was the unchallenged foundation of science, philosophy, and medicine. Alchemists, the proto-chemists of the medieval period, based their entire quest on this principle. Their goal was to manipulate the balance of elements within base metals like lead, removing the qualities of earth and imbuing them with the properties of fire and air to transform them into noble gold. Their laboratories were filled with processes designed to separate and recombine these essences through heating, cooling, dissolving, and distilling. Can you see the immense power of such a simple, unified theory? It connected the human body to the weather and the weather to the stars, creating a universe that was interconnected and profoundly logical. The slow unraveling of this beautiful system began in the 17th century with pioneers like Robert Boyle, who began to question the very definition of an element. The final death knell came with John Dalton's atomic theory in the early 1800s, which proposed that all matter was composed of tiny, indivisible atoms of different elements, not just four cosmic principles. The solid Earth was not a fundamental element, but a complex mixture of dozens of different atomic elements like silicon and oxygen. The air was a blend of nitrogen and oxygen. Fire was not an element at all, but a chemical reaction. This new, invisible world of atoms was far less intuitive than the tangible reality of earth, air, fire, and water. It required a leap of faith in instruments and mathematics, a departure from the evidence of the senses. The four elements had offered a world you could feel and see, a philosophy as solid as the ground beneath your feet, until science revealed a universe built from a hidden and far more numerous set of blocks. While the world was built from four elements, the human mind was thought to be mapped on the surface of the skull. In the early 19th century, a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall introduced a new and captivating science, phrenology. He proposed that the brain was not a single organ, but a collection of distinct faculties, each governing a specific aspect of personality or ability. Gall believed these mental organs, from your sense of humor to your capacity for theft, physically grew with use. A highly developed faculty would push outward against the skull, creating a visible bump, while an underused one would leave a depression. The logic was simple and seductive. You could literally read a person's character by carefully feeling the contours of their head. Can you picture the scene? A phrenologist running their fingers over a client's scalp, charting the landscape of their supposed virtues and vices. Gall and his followers meticulously mapped the skull into dozens of regions, each corresponding to a trait. A bump just above the ear might indicate destructiveness, while a prominent forehead could signal intellect and benevolence. The system promised a tangible key to the mysteries of human nature, a biological basis for personality that anyone could learn to interpret. It quickly became a popular sensation, a form of entertainment and self-discovery in parlors and public lectures across Europe and America. But this seemingly innocent practice soon revealed a much darker side. Phrenology was eagerly adopted by those with prejudiced agendas, providing a seemingly scientific justification for racism and social inequality. Proponents would measure the skulls of different ethnic groups, inevitably finding that European skulls showed the most desirable bumps for intellect and morality, while those of other races were declared inferior. It was used to argue that certain people were naturally suited for servitude or were inherently prone to criminality, their fate supposedly written in the very bone of their heads. The system created a biological prison where a person's potential was predetermined by their cranial geography. This pseudoscience even influenced the legal system, with some arguing that criminals bore the physical stigmata of their immoral tendencies, making them incapable of reform. The decline of phrenology was as inevitable as its rise was swift. As real brain science advanced, researchers found no correlation between the external shape of the skull and the internal structure of the brain. The cortex does not function as a set of isolated, enlarging organs, and the thickness of the skull bone varies naturally, completely unrelated to mental power or moral character. By the late 19th century, it was exposed as a complete fraud, a classic example of seeing patterns where none exist. Yet its legacy lingered, a stark warning of how easily a scientific-sounding idea can be twisted to confirm our deepest biases, and how the desire to neatly categorize human complexity can lead us to the most dehumanizing conclusions. Even as phrenologists were mapping the mind on the skull, physicists were convinced the cosmos was filled with an invisible sea. To explain how light could travel through the empty vacuum of space, 19th century science proposed the luminiferous ether. This was not a mythical substance from legend, but a serious scientific hypothesis. It was believed to be a massless, perfectly frictionless medium that permeated every corner of the universe, an unseen ocean through which waves of light rippled, much like sound waves travel through air. The ether was the essential, stationary stage upon which the drama of light and energy played out. Without it, light seemed to have nothing to wave through, a paradox that demanded an answer. This belief underpinned all of classical physics, a fundamental pillar supporting the understanding of energy, motion, and the very fabric of reality. It was a beautifully elegant solution to a profound mystery, giving the emptiness of space a tangible, albeit invisible, structure. But how do you prove the existence of something you cannot see, touch, or measure directly? This challenge fell to two American scientists, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley. In 1887, they designed an exquisitely sensitive experiment to catch the ether in the act. Their reasoning was brilliant. If the ether was a stationary medium, then the Earth, as it hurtled through space in its orbit around the Sun, should be moving through it. This should create an ether wind, a detectable drift flowing past the planet. Their apparatus, called an interferometer, was designed to measure the speed of light traveling in two different directions, one with this hypothetical wind and one against it. They expected to find a tiny but crucial difference in light's velocity, the definitive fingerprint of the ether's presence. The entire scientific world waited for their results, anticipating a triumphant confirmation of a fundamental truth. The outcome was not just a failure, it was a shattering null result. No matter how they oriented their device, no matter how many times they repeated the measurement, Michelson and Morley could detect no ether wind whatsoever. The speed of light was constant in every direction. It was as if a sailor in the middle of a stormy sea dropped a plumb line and found the ocean was perfectly still. The result was baffling. The ether, the cornerstone of physics, simply was not there. The scientific community was thrown into crisis. Some tried to patch the theory, suggesting the ether was dragged along by the Earth, but these explanations were clumsy and unconvincing. The null result of the Michelson-Morley experiment was a ghost in the machine of physics, an anomaly that refused to go away. For nearly 2 decades, it remained an unsolved puzzle, a quiet revolution waiting for its architect. That architect was a young patent clerk named Albert Einstein. In 1905, he proposed his special theory of relativity, which made a breathtakingly bold assertion. There was no luminiferous ether because there was no need for one. Light, Einstein declared, did not require a medium. It was a fundamental constant of the universe, and its speed was the same for all observers, regardless of their own motion. This single idea rewrote the laws of physics, merging space and time into a single continuum and leading to the most famous equation in history. The failed hunt for the ether did not close a door. It blew the walls off the entire building, revealing a universe far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to imagine. While Einstein was redefining the cosmos, the political world had once been governed by a principle just as absolute as the luminiferous ether. A king's right to rule was thought to be a direct command from heaven. This was the divine right of kings, a doctrine that fused spiritual and earthly power into one unassailable whole. It declared that a monarch was not merely a political leader, but God's personal lieutenant on earth. His authority came not from the consent of the people or from any parliament, but directly from the Almighty. To question the king was to question God himself. This belief provided the ultimate justification for absolute rule, creating a system where the sovereign was accountable to no one but God. The origins of this idea stretch back to medieval Europe, but it found its most powerful expression in the 16th and 17th centuries. Kings like James I of England eloquently defended the doctrine, writing that monarchs were gods upon earth, and that rebellion against them was the worst of all possible sins. He argued that even a tyrannical king was a punishment sent by God, and that suffering under his rule was a religious duty. Can you comprehend the sheer political power of such a belief? It made dissent not just treason but blasphemy. The entire social order, from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble, was locked into a divine hierarchy with an appointed king at its pinnacle. This was not a vague sentiment, it was a carefully crafted political theology used to centralize power and crush opposition. In France, King Louis XIV, the famed Sun King, embodied this principle perfectly. His legendary statement, "I am the state," was the divine right of kings in its purest form. He ruled without a chief minister, believing his power was a personal, God-given burden and privilege. His magnificent palace at Versailles was not just a home, it was a physical manifestation of this belief, a gilded cage designed to draw the nobility to court and keep them under his direct control, away from their own power bases. The entire culture of his court revolved around the king's divine person, from the elaborate rituals of his waking up to the ceremonies of his meals. Every gesture reinforced the idea that he was a sacred being, and that proximity to him was a form of grace. For a time, this belief created incredibly stable, centralized states. But a system that places a human being beyond all earthly challenge is bound to eventually fracture. The first great crack appeared in England. The stubborn belief of King Charles I in his divine right led him to repeatedly clash with Parliament over taxes and religious policy. He believed he was answerable only to God, while Parliament argued it represented the will of the nation. This fundamental conflict spiraled into the English Civil War, a brutal conflict that pitted royalists against parliamentarians. The unthinkable happened. The king's forces were defeated, Charles was captured, put on trial for treason, and in a shocking act that reverberated across Europe, publicly beheaded in 1649. The execution of a king, an anointed sovereign, was a direct attack on the very heart of the divine right doctrine. It proved that a monarch could be held accountable by his people. Although the monarchy was later restored, the principle was forever wounded. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 cemented this shift when Parliament deposed King James II and offered the throne to William and Mary under a new Bill of Rights. This established once and for all that ultimate sovereignty in England resided not with the crown but with Parliament. The final philosophical blow to divine right came from the Enlightenment. Thinkers like John Locke argued that government's legitimacy came from a social contract with the governed, not a mandate from heaven. He proposed that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that a government which violated those rights could be legitimately overthrown. This radical idea inverted the entire system. Power flowed upward from the people, not downward from God. These converging forces, the political shock of regicide and the intellectual revolution of the Enlightenment, dismantled a belief that had undergirded centuries of rule. They paved the way for the modern world, for constitutions, for representative democracy, and for the radical notion that those who govern must have the consent of the governed. The same urge to find a complete miniature blueprint existed within the study of life itself. For centuries, the mystery of human development was solved by a theory called preformationism. It proposed a breathtakingly simple answer to the question of where babies come from. Inside every sperm or egg, scientists believed, resided a tiny, fully formed human being, a homunculus that simply grew larger during gestation. This was not a metaphor, it was a literal belief that you started your existence as a perfectly scaled-down person, curled up and waiting to unfold. Can you conceive of the implications? It meant that within the first homunculus resided another, even smaller one, and within that another, like an infinite set of Russian dolls stretching back to Eve or Adam. This idea conveniently sidestepped the truly perplexing question of how life could assemble itself from nothing, offering instead a vision of pre-packed existence. The scientific community, however, split into two warring camps over the location of this miniature human. The spermists, armed with the newly invented microscope, pointed to the male seed. When they peered through their primitive lenses at human sperm, they were convinced they could see the homunculus inside, a tiny man with a large head and folded limbs. Illustrations from the time depict these minuscule beings floating serenely within the head of a sperm cell. The rival camp, the ovists, argued just as fiercely that the preformed human resided within the woman's egg. They believed the male seed merely provided a vital spark that activated the growth of the miniature person already present in the ovum. This debate was not a minor academic squabble, it was a major scientific conflict about the very nature of human origins, with each side marshalling its own microscopic observations as proof. The logic seemed unassailable. If you could see a tiny person in the making, then development was just a matter of expansion, not creation. The theory began to crumble under the weight of its own absurdity and improving technology. As microscopes became more powerful, no one could consistently find these miniature humans. The structures initially identified as homunculi were revealed to be optical illusions or simple cellular debris. Even more damning was the logical problem of inheritance. If every generation was nested inside the last, then every genetic flaw, every scar, every trait of every ancestor must be pre-written into the first human. The theory also completely failed to explain why children often resemble both parents, a fatal blow to both spermist and ovist views. The final dismantling of preformationism came with the correct theory of epigenesis, the idea that an embryo develops progressively from an undifferentiated state, gradually building new structures and complexity through a series of stages. The philosopher and biologist Caspar Friedrich Wolff provided crucial evidence demonstrating that in chick embryos, the intestines do not simply uncoil from a pre-existing tiny tube, but form anew from flat sheets of tissue. Life was not a process of mere inflation, but one of breathtakingly complex construction, a symphony of cellular division and differentiation that builds a human being from the ground up. The homunculus vanished from science, leaving behind a legacy of a beautiful, simple, and utterly wrong answer to one of life's greatest mysteries. Far across the map, in the mysterious lands beyond the known world, medieval Europe dreamed of a savior. The legend of Pasteur John spoke of a mighty Christian king, a patriarch who ruled a vast and utopian empire of unimaginable wealth and piety somewhere in the distant east. His kingdom was said to be a paradise on earth, filled with gems as large as boulders, rivers of gold, and fantastical creatures like griffins and giants. Most importantly, it was a land free from sin and want, governed by a ruler so just and powerful that he commanded 72 kings as his vassals. This was not just a fairy tale, it was a geopolitical hope. At a time when Crusader states in the Holy Land were crumbling, the idea of a powerful Christian ally appearing from behind enemy lines to crush Islam was a potent fantasy that captured the imagination of popes and princes alike. The legend truly ignited in the 12th century with the circulation of a letter, a document addressed to the Byzantine emperor and the pope, which described Pasteur John's kingdom in breathtaking, impossible detail. The letter claimed his palace was built of crystal, his scepter was carved from a single emerald, and his table was made of solid gold. It spoke of a fountain of youth that granted immortality and a mysterious mirror that allowed the king to see every corner of his domain. This letter was a masterpiece of forgery, a medieval hoax that was copied and spread across Europe, read in churches and royal courts as absolute truth. Can you sense the desperate hope in that act, the willingness to believe in a salvation myth when reality was so grim? This belief directly shaped the course of exploration for centuries. When the Mongol Empire emerged in the 13th century, European travelers like Marco Polo headed east with one eye open, fully expecting to find Pasteur John's kingdom nestled among the Asian steppes. They heard rumors and identified various powerful figures as the legendary king, only to be disappointed. As exploration proved there was no Christian utopia in Asia, the legend simply packed its bags and moved. Cartographers began placing the kingdom on maps of Africa, speculating it was the source of the Nile, hidden somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia. Portuguese explorers sailing down the African coast in the 15th century were explicitly tasked with making contact with Pasteur John, hoping to forge an alliance that would encircle the Islamic world. They did eventually find a Christian kingdom in Ethiopia, but it was a real, struggling nation, not the mythical empire of endless gold and magical fountains. The stark reality could not live up to the centuries of fantasy. The slow, painstaking process of mapping the world eventually left no room for the kingdom. The legend of Pasteur John faded, a beautiful dream that had guided explorers and sustained crusaders, only to vanish like a mirage when confronted with the hard, unyielding truth of geography. It stands as a powerful testament to how a story, once believed, can alter the course of history, sending ships into the unknown in pursuit of a hope that never truly existed. 17th century medicine offered a cure that seemed to defy all logic. A soldier is wounded by a sword on a distant battlefield, yet the physician does not tend to the man. Instead, he retrieves the bloody weapon, carefully anoints it with a special ointment known as the weapon salve, and places it in a cool place. Miles away, as if by magic, the soldier's own wound begins to heal. This was not folklore, but a serious medical procedure championed by respected intellectuals like Sir Kenelm Digby. He promoted a powerful belief in action at a distance, a form of healing that treated the cause rather than the effect. The logic rested on a concept of cosmic sympathy, an invisible web connecting all things that had once been in contact. The blood on the sword retained a mystical link to the blood in the soldier's body. By applying the soothing, cooling salve to the weapon, that healing influence was thought to travel instantly along this invisible thread, bringing relief to the injury itself. The most famous version of this cure, the powder of sympathy, was even more peculiar. It was not a salve at all, but a rusty copper sulfate powder that was applied to the blood-stained weapon. The theory held that as the powder worked to dry and cleanse the blood on the sword, it would simultaneously dry and cleanse the wound, preventing infection and promoting closure from afar. Can you grasp the strange elegance of this idea that the universe was so intimately connected that you could heal a man by treating the metal that had harmed him? This belief perfectly reflected a pre-scientific world, where invisible forces and sympathies were as real as physical matter. It was an attempt to explain phenomena that had no other explanation, a desperate reach for order in a chaotic world. The practice eventually faded as the scientific revolution advanced, offering more tangible, evidence-based explanations for infection and healing. Yet it stands as a haunting reminder of a time when the line between medicine and magic was blurred, and a cure could be as strange as the wound it was meant to heal. But the universe, governed by cosmic sympathy, also had a rigid, vertical spine. For centuries, the dominant worldview was not one of dynamic change, but of a perfect, static hierarchy known as the Great Chain of Being. This was the ultimate organizational chart for all of creation, a ladder that stretched from the depths of the earth to the throne of God. At the very top was the divine creator, followed in descending order by the ranks of angels, then humanity, then animals, then plants, and finally, at the very bottom, the minerals of the earth. Every single thing had its preordained, unchangeable place. A king was above a noble above a peasant, a man above a woman, a lion above a worm, an oak tree above a blade of grass. This was not seen as a social construct, but as a fundamental law of the cosmos, as immutable as gravity. Can you feel the weight of that order, the sense that to challenge your position was to disrupt the harmony of the entire universe? This belief provided the ultimate justification for the social and political structures of the time. The feudal system, with its king, lords, and serfs, was not just a convenient arrangement of power, it was a reflection of the divine order. A peasant was born to serve his lord, just as a dog was born to serve a man, and a rock was born to sit in the ground. To aspire for social mobility was not just ambition, it was a form of cosmic rebellion, an attempt to climb a rung on a ladder that was fixed by God himself. This thinking was used for centuries to resist any notion of equality or reform. The chain was a complete and closed system. There were no missing links and no room for new forms. This is why the idea of evolution, when it first began to surface, was so profoundly threatening. The concept that a species could change over time, that a simple organism could give rise to a complex one, directly attacked the very core of the great chain of being. If a whale could share a common ancestor with a cow, then the clear, distinct boundaries between the ranks of animals began to blur. The chain did not allow for such fluidity, it demanded permanent, fixed categories. The same logic was used to oppose social change. Why educate the poor or grant rights to commoners? That would be to move them from their God-given station, introducing chaos into a perfectly designed system. The strength of this belief lay in its beautiful, terrifying simplicity. It offered an answer for everything, a reason for every inequality, and a promise of stability in a world that often felt chaotic. It took the slow, grinding work of scientific discovery and social revolution to finally break the chain, revealing a world not of fixed ranks, but of constant, dynamic, and interconnected change. That same terror of poisoned air took on a specific and suffocating form after the sun went down. For generations, people across Europe and the Americas firmly believed that night air itself was a lethal miasma. The darkness did not just conceal dangers, it was the danger, a thick, damp vapor that carried fevers and death into the lungs of anyone brave or foolish enough to breathe it freely. This fear was so ingrained that it dictated the architecture of life. Houses were designed with tightly sealed windows, and families would retire to bedrooms that had been shuttered since dusk, preferring to swelter in stagnant, stuffy rooms rather than risk a single breath of the cool night breeze. Travelers were warned never to sleep in the open air, and hospitals, places already filled with sickness, would keep their windows firmly latched, trapping the very germs they hoped to keep out, all in a desperate effort to barricade against the invisible enemy of the night. This belief even gave us the name for one of history's great scourges, The word malaria comes directly from the Italian for bad air, mala aria, because the disease was so prevalent in swampy regions where the night air was considered especially foul and thick with mist. The correlation seemed undeniable. People who slept outside or near marshes often fell ill with the characteristic chills and fevers, so the cause was assigned to the air they breathed in the darkness. Can you envision the self-imposed prison this created? A world where the simple, natural act of breathing under the stars was seen as a potentially fatal mistake. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both a liberation and a stunning irony. The real culprit was not the air of the night, but a tiny insect that thrived in it. With the discovery of mosquitoes as the vector for malaria and other diseases in the late 19th century, the entire foundation of the night air fear collapsed. The danger was not a generalized atmospheric poison, but a very specific bite from a carrier that happened to be most active between dusk and dawn. People had been locking their windows against a phantom, while the true assassin was freely flying in the rooms with them, or breeding in the stagnant water just outside their homes. The recommendation from doctors flipped entirely. Public health campaigns now urged people to install screens on their windows and to sleep under mosquito nets to let the fresh air circulate while keeping the insects out. The long-held dread of night air vanished almost overnight, replaced by a new understanding that would eventually help eradicate malaria from many parts of the world. It was a profound lesson in misidentified causes, a reminder that sometimes the most logical correlation can point us in exactly the wrong direction. Deep within the quest to master the elements lay the ultimate prize, a substance that promised command over matter and life itself. Alchemists across the ancient and medieval worlds dedicated their lives to the search for the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary material believed to perform two miraculous feats. The first was the transmutation of base metals like lead into pure, perfect gold. The second, even more profound, was the creation of the elixir of life, a potion that could cure all diseases and grant immortality. This was not a mere fairy tale. It was a serious scientific and spiritual pursuit that consumed some of the brightest minds for centuries. The origins of alchemy stretch back to Hellenistic Egypt, but it was in the Islamic Golden Age and later in medieval Europe that the search intensified. Alchemists worked in secretive laboratories filled with alembics and furnaces, convinced that the universe operated on principles of transformation and perfection. They saw the process of turning a dull, heavy metal like lead into brilliant gold as the ultimate purification, a metaphor for the human soul's own journey toward spiritual enlightenment. One of the most famous and influential figures was Theophrastus von Hohenheim, known as Paracelsus, a 16th-century Swiss physician who revolutionized alchemical thought. He shifted the focus away from solely making gold and toward what he called iatrochemistry, or medical alchemy. Paracelsus believed the Philosopher's Stone was the key to creating powerful medicines, and he aggressively used alchemical techniques to prepare new chemical remedies, challenging the outdated medical doctrines of his time. His work, though still mystical, began to bind alchemy more closely to the practical art of healing. Can you sense the powerful drive behind this centuries-long search? It was a combination of raw ambition, spiritual yearning, and a genuine desire to unlock the deepest secrets of nature. The methods were complex and symbolic, often described in cryptic texts filled with images of dragons, kings, and lions. An alchemist might spend years trying to create the proper blackened matter, the nigrido, which was thought to be the first stage in the lengthy process toward the stone. The entire practice was shrouded in secrecy, both to protect valuable discoveries and to avoid accusations of heresy or witchcraft from the authorities. Yet this pursuit of an impossible goal yielded astonishingly real and practical results. In their frantic experiments, alchemists invented and perfected many of the fundamental tools and processes of modern chemistry. They discovered new elements and compounds, developed vital laboratory techniques like distillation, filtration, and crystallization, and created a vast catalogue of reactions and substances. The very equipment they used, their beakers and flasks, became the foundation of the modern chemistry lab. The slow realization that the philosopher's stone was a mythical object did not invalidate their centuries of work, it simply redirected it. The mystical language of transmutation gradually gave way to the precise language of atomic theory and chemical equations. The dream of turning lead into gold was finally achieved, not by magic, but by nuclear physics in the 20th century, a process so expensive and complex it made the alchemical dream pointless. The long, strange quest for the stone was a magnificent failure that accidentally built the very science that made it obsolete. While alchemists searched for the stone to perfect matter, physicians believed they had already found the source of a woman's imperfection. It was an organ with a mind of its own, the womb. Ancient Greek medicine, as recorded in the foundational Hippocratic corpus, described the uterus not as a fixed part of the anatomy, but as a living, wandering creature inside a woman's body. They thought it could detach and roam freely through her torso, migrating upward toward her liver or downward toward her heart. Wherever this restless womb decided to settle, it would press against other organs, creating a cascade of terrifying symptoms. If it moved to her diaphragm, she might feel she was choking, a sensation called globus hystericus. If it journeyed to her chest, it could cause palpitations and anxiety. A woman suffering from this wandering womb might experience fainting fits, paralysis, emotional outbursts, or a deep sense of suffocation. The very name of the condition, hysteria, comes directly from the Greek word for womb, hystera. Can you comprehend the sheer terror of such a diagnosis, the belief that your own body housed a rebellious animal that could cripple you at will? The proposed cures were as bizarre as the theory itself. Since the womb was thought to be attracted to pleasant smells and repelled by foul ones, doctors would prescribe treatments based on this logic. To lure a womb that had risen too high back into its proper place, they would place foul-smelling substances like ammonia or burning hair near a woman's nose, while simultaneously applying sweet perfumes to her lower body. The idea was to drive the womb downward with stench and attract it with fragrance, like trying to coax a stray animal back into its cage. This belief was not a fringe idea. It was mainstream medical doctrine for centuries, cementing a view of female biology as inherently unstable and prone to malfunction. The concept was refined but never truly abandoned for nearly 2,000 years. In the 19th century, the diagnosis of hysteria exploded in popularity, now stripped of the literal wandering womb, but still blaming a woman's reproductive system for any neurological or psychological symptom that doctors could not explain. The treatment shifted from smelly rags to the new and controversial technology of the vibrator, used in doctors' offices to induce paroxysms, or what we would now call orgasms, which were seen as a medical release of nervous tension. The entire history of hysteria is a stark lesson in how a mistaken biological theory can be used to pathologize and control half the human population, attributing their very real suffering to a phantom of medical imagination. It was only with the dawn of modern psychology and neurology that hysteria was finally dismissed as a valid diagnosis. Its symptoms correctly reattributed to conditions like conversion disorder, epilepsy, or post-traumatic stress. The wandering womb had finally been laid to rest, but its long shadow reminds us how easily anatomy can be twisted into destiny. This idea of a wandering womb framed the female mind as inherently flawed, but a new philosophy was about to declare all minds equal at birth. 17th century thinker John Locke proposed a radical and democratic vision of human nature, the concept of the blank slate or tabula rasa. He argued that when we are born, our minds are like empty writing tablets, completely devoid of any innate ideas, principles, or knowledge. Everything we know, everything we become, from the most complex moral concept to the simplest sensation of color, is inscribed upon this slate solely through our life experiences. Our senses, Locke claimed, are the only windows to the world, and through them, all the materials of reason and knowledge enter. Can you feel the immense optimism of this idea? It meant that no one was born superior or pre-programmed for greatness. A prince and a pauper started life with the exact same mental capacity, a perfectly blank page. Their differing stations in life were not a result of divine right or inherent nobility, but solely a product of their environment, their education, and the sensory information they had accumulated. This belief was a direct assault on the rigid hierarchies of the great chain of being. It suggested that human potential was not fixed at birth but was infinitely malleable. The implications for education were revolutionary. If the mind was a blank slate, then the right kind of teaching could shape anyone into a virtuous and knowledgeable citizen. This fueled a new emphasis on universal schooling and progressive teaching methods, all designed to carefully inscribe the right lessons onto the young, impressionable mind. Politically, the blank slate was a weapon against tyranny. It undermined the doctrine of the divine right of kings by arguing that leaders were not born with a special understanding of governance. They were simply men who had been exposed to the right experiences. It provided a philosophical foundation for democracy and social reform, suggesting that by changing a person's environment, you could change their destiny. This idea dominated Western thought for centuries, but the slate began to show cracks with the dawn of modern science. The field of genetics revealed that we are not born as blank canvases, but with a complex blueprint of inherited traits and predispositions. Psychology showed that newborns have innate fears, such as a startle response to loud noises, and a remarkable pre-wired capacity to learn language. A baby does not need to be taught the rules of grammar. It is born with a brain structured to acquire them effortlessly from the surrounding chatter. The blank slate was not entirely wrong. Experience is the essential ink that writes our life story. But we are not born with empty pages. We are born with the lines already ruled, the chapters pre-outlined, and a unique font already chosen. Our minds are less like a blank slate and more like a book waiting to be written, its fundamental structure and potential already bound within its covers. Fire was a riddle that demanded an answer. For much of the 17th and 18th centuries, the best scientific minds explained the very nature of flames with a substance that did not exist, an element they called phlogiston. According to its proponents, anything that could burn, from a log to a piece of coal, was rich in this mysterious fire stuff. The process of combustion was simply the release of phlogiston into the air. A burning log was shedding its phlogiston, leaving behind a lighter pile of ash. This elegant idea seemed to explain so much. It accounted for why a candle would eventually snuff out under a glass jar, the air inside having become saturated with phlogiston and unable to absorb any more. It even extended to the rusting of metals, which was seen as a very slow release of phlogiston, explaining why a rusty piece of iron often weighed more than a clean one, the lost phlogiston having been replaced by something else from the air. Can you see the internal logic, how this single, invisible actor could play a role in both a roaring fire and the silent decay of a nail? The theory was beautifully consistent, a complete system that made the confusing process of burning feel understandable. Yet this very consistency contained a fatal flaw, a paradox that would ultimately unravel the entire idea. If phlogiston was a substance being released during burning, then why did the resulting ashes, now supposedly devoid of phlogiston, weigh more than the original material? How could the act of losing something make an object heavier? Proponents of the theory devised awkward explanations, sometimes suggesting that phlogiston had negative weight or levity, a concept that felt like a desperate attempt to patch a leaking ship. The man who would scuttle that ship was a French chemist named Antoine Lavoisier. He was a meticulous experimenter who believed in precise measurement above all else. In a series of brilliant experiments, he carefully heated metals in sealed containers. He observed that the metal gained weight as it turned into a powder, a calx, but that the total weight of the entire sealed system remained unchanged. The air inside the container, however, had changed. A portion of it had been consumed. Lavoisier realized that the metal was not losing a mysterious element, but was combining with a specific component of the air. He named this component oxygen. Combustion was not the release of phlogiston, but a chemical combination with oxygen. The rusting of iron was the same process, a slow marriage with oxygen from the atmosphere. Even respiration, the very breath of life, was recast as a slow, internal combustion where the body uses oxygen from the air. Lavoisier had not merely discovered a new gas, he had overturned an entire worldview. The phlogiston theory, which had guided chemistry for a century, vanished almost overnight, consigned to the history books by the relentless logic of the balance sheet. It was a stunning demonstration that even the most elegant and widely accepted belief must eventually bend to the uncompromising truth of careful measurement. Our own planet once held the undisputed center stage of the entire cosmos. For nearly 2,000 years, the most logical and self-evident truth was that the Earth stood motionless at the heart of creation, with the sun, moon, planets, and stars all performing a daily dance around us. This geocentric model, perfected by the Greek astronomer Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century, was a masterpiece of mathematical reasoning. It perfectly matched the observations of the naked eye. Every day, the sun rose in the east and set in the west. The stars wheeled across the night sky in perfect, fixed patterns. It felt true because it looked true. But there was a problem. The planets, the wanderers, did not move in simple, predictable paths. They would slow down, speed up, and even loop backwards in the sky in a baffling retrograde motion. To explain this within an Earth-centered universe, Ptolemy devised an ingenious but incredibly complex system. He proposed that the planets moved in small circles called epicycles, whose centers themselves traveled along larger circles around the Earth. It was a cosmic clockwork of circles within circles, a mathematical contortion designed to preserve the central, unmoving status of our world. Can you picture the intellectual dedication it took to maintain this celestial Rube Goldberg machine, all to keep humanity at the center of everything? This belief was not just a scientific theory, it was a theological and philosophical pillar. It placed humanity in a position of cosmic importance, the literal focal point of God's creation. The Church embraced this view, seeing it as perfectly aligned with Scripture, which often described the earth as established and immovable. To suggest otherwise was not merely a scientific heresy, but a spiritual one. This is why the work of Nicolaus Copernicus in the 16th century was so revolutionary and dangerous. On his deathbed, he published a book proposing a sun-centered or heliocentric model. He argued that placing the sun at the center simplified the math enormously, making the strange retrograde loops of Mars and Jupiter a simple illusion caused by our own moving Earth overtaking them in their orbits. The idea was brilliant, but it was also largely ignored or dismissed for decades. It took the observations of Galileo Galilei and his telescope to provide the physical proof. Galileo saw moons orbiting Jupiter, a clear model of a system that did not revolve around Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, which could only happen if it orbited the Sun. He published his findings in plain Italian for everyone to read, directly challenging the academic and religious authorities. The backlash was swift and severe. Galileo was put on trial by the Roman Inquisition, forced to recant his findings, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The universe, it seemed, was not allowed to be centered on the sun. Yet the evidence continued to mount. Johannes Kepler, using the precise observational data of his mentor Tycho Brahe, discovered that the planets moved not in perfect circles, but in ellipses, finally dismantling the need for Ptolemy's cumbersome epicycles. The geocentric model, with all its beautiful complexity, collapsed under the weight of simple, observable truth. The Earth was demoted from the throne of the universe to just another planet orbiting an ordinary star, a humbling realization that forever changed our place in the cosmos. Even after Ritty's work with maggots, the debate over life's origins was far from settled. The invention of the microscope revealed a teeming, invisible world, and this new frontier became the last refuge for the idea of spontaneous generation. Scientists could now see bacteria and other microorganisms appearing in boiled broths and hay infusions, seemingly conjured from nothing. How could these tiny creatures come from eggs too small to see? It seemed logical to assume they simply sprang to life from the nutrient-rich liquid itself. This belief was not held by the uneducated. It was championed by respected naturalists who argued that a vital force within certain materials could spontaneously give rise to these microscopic beings. This was a stubborn ghost of an ancient idea, refusing to die even as science advanced. The implications for medicine were dire. If germs could simply generate from spoiled broth or stagnant water, then controlling disease seemed an impossible task. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation. The man who would deliver the final blow was Louis Pasteur. He suspected that these microbes were not spontaneously generated, but were entering the liquid from the surrounding air. To prove it, he designed an experiment of breathtaking elegance. He created flasks with long, thin necks that curved downward like the neck of a swan. He filled these flasks with a broth that would easily spoil, and then he boiled them, killing any life inside. The magic of his design was in the curved neck. Air could freely flow in and out, but any dust particles or microbial spores carried in that air became trapped in the moist, curved tube, unable to reach the sterile broth. For months, the broth in these swan neck flasks remained perfectly clear. No life appeared. Then, in a dramatic finale, Pasteur tilted one of the flasks, allowing the broth to flow into the curved neck where the dust had settled, and then tilted it back. Within days, that flask was clouded with microbial life. He had demonstrated with undeniable clarity that the microbes came from outside, from the dust in the air. They did not generate from the broth. Life only came from pre-existing life. This single experiment shattered the 2,000-year-old belief in spontaneous generation for good. It was a victory that did more than just win a philosophical argument. It provided the foundation for the germ theory of disease, revolutionizing surgery, food preservation, and public health. The invisible world, once a realm of mystery and spontaneous creation, was now a place of order where every microbe had a parent. The human body itself was seen as a substance to be sculpted. Long before modern notions of genetics, many cultures held a powerful belief that infants were physically malleable, their soft bones and pliable forms capable of being shaped by deliberate human hands. This was not an act of cruelty, but a profound expression of cultural values, an attempt to mold a child literally and figuratively into an ideal member of society. In ancient Sparta, famous for its warrior culture, newborns were examined by elders. Those deemed weak or unfit were left exposed to the elements, a brutal form of selection. For those who passed, the shaping began almost immediately. They were bathed in wine instead of water, a practice believed to toughen their bodies. They were swaddled tightly to encourage straight, strong limbs, their physical form being prepared for a lifetime of discipline and battle. This was an early, harsh form of believing a child's body was a lump of clay to be hardened into a specific, useful shape. But the most striking examples of this belief are found in the practice of cranial deformation. Across the ancient world, from the Maya of Central America to the Mangbetu people of Central Africa, and among certain Native American tribes like the Chinookan peoples of the Pacific Northwest, parents would gently reshape the soft skulls of their infants. They used a combination of tight binding, padding, and flat boards to apply steady, constant pressure to the forehead and the back of the head over the first few months of life. This process, performed with care, would gradually elongate the skull, creating a distinctive, sloping profile that was permanently set by the time the child's bones fused. Why would a parent do this? The reasons were deeply embedded in their worldview. An elongated head was not a deformity. It was a mark of beauty, a sign of high status, and often a symbol of nobility and intelligence. It visually set the elite apart from the common people. Can you see the powerful statement being made? A family was literally sculpting their child's future identity, creating a physical manifestation of their social standing that the child would carry for life. The cradleboard, used by many indigenous cultures across North America, served a dual purpose. While it was a practical and safe way to carry an infant, its tight wrappings and firm backing also applied gentle pressure that subtly flattened the back of the baby's head. This was often considered a desirable trait, a sign of good upbringing. These practices reveal a universal human impulse, the desire to imprint our cultural ideals directly onto the next generation. We no longer bind skulls, but the impulse to shape our children remains, channeled now through education, sports, and the relentless pursuit of certain ideals. The belief that a child's body and potential are infinitely moldable is a powerful force, one that can build a stronger society or, as history shows, bend a human form to fit an aesthetic dream. For a civilization that mapped its world with such precision, the Egyptians held one destination in a sacred, shimmering haze. Deep to the south, beyond the known territories of Nubia, lay the land of Punt, a realm of almost mythical abundance. This was not merely a trading partner, it was a divine source, the homeland of the gods themselves. Pharaohs dispatched massive, state-funded expeditions to this fabled land, seeking what they could not find anywhere else. The most famous of these voyages was commissioned by the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, who immortalized the journey on the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple. The reliefs depict vast ships setting sail down the Red Sea, returning laden with treasures that seem to confirm Punt's otherworldly nature. They brought back heaps of fragrant myrrh and frankincense resin, essential for temple rituals and believed to be the very sweat of the gods. They carried live myrrh trees, their roots carefully balled in baskets for replanting in Egypt, a direct transplant of divine fragrance. The exotic animals were just as startling, with baboons, giraffes, and leopards adding to the spectacle of a land that defied normal geography. The people of Punt were depicted living in beehive-shaped huts built on stilts above the water, a detail that fascinated the Egyptians and added to the region's mysterious aura. Yet for all these detailed records, the actual location of Punt remains one of history's great puzzles. Was it in modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or further south along the African coast? The debate continues because the Egyptians themselves seemed less concerned with precise coordinates. Punt was more than a spot on a map. It was a concept, a land of origins and primal connection to the divine. It was the place where the gods had once dwelled, a paradise lost to time but still accessible through great effort and royal will. The trading expeditions were as much pilgrimages as commercial ventures, a journey to reconnect with the source of life's most precious substances. Can you sense the power of such a belief? It drove entire fleets into the unknown, not just for gold, but for a tangible piece of the divine, a scent that could bridge the gap between the human world and the realm of the gods. The land of Punt was a real place that traded real goods, yet in the Egyptian mind, it was also a semi-mythical dream, a paradise that anchored their entire cosmology and gave them a direct line to creation itself. The same scientific revolution that dismantled ancient superstitions accidentally birthed a new and dazzling danger. At the dawn of the 20th century, the discovery of radium felt like a miracle. Here was an element that glowed with an unearthly light, seemingly creating its own energy from nothing. It was easy to believe that this magical power could be transferred to the human body. Radium was not just a scientific curiosity, it was marketed as a panacea, a cure-all that could infuse vitality and conquer disease. The public embraced it with an enthusiasm that now seems terrifying. You could buy radium-infused tonics promising to restore your youth and vigor. There were radioactive cosmetics to rejuvenate the skin, and even devices to irradiate your food and water. Wealthy patrons flocked to health spas where they sat in rooms filled with radon gas, breathing in the radioactive vapor for its supposed curative properties. One of the most popular products was a radium-lined jar called the Rivergator, which you would fill with water and let sit overnight, creating what was advertised as a daily health tonic charged with radioactive energy. Can you picture the optimism, the sheer faith in this glowing new science that led people to willingly drink and breathe something we now know is profoundly toxic? The tragic consequences unfolded with horrific slowness. The most famous victims were the radium girls, young women employed in factories to paint watch and clock dials with luminous radium-based paint. Their job was delicate, requiring a fine point on the brush, which they were instructed to shape by tapping the brush between their lips. With every lick, they ingested tiny amounts of radium. At first, the work was glamorous and well-paid. The women would paint their nails and teeth with the glowing substance for fun, unaware they were being poisoned from within. Years later, the effects became gruesomely apparent. The radium, mimicking calcium, settled in their bones, causing them to crumble and rot. Their jaws literally disintegrated, a condition dubbed radium jaw. They developed severe anemia, suffered from bone cancers, and endured agonizing pain. The companies, aware of the dangers, denied any responsibility for years, forcing these dying women to fight a brutal legal battle for justice. Their suffering and their eventual court victory were the turning point. It forced the world to confront the deadly reality behind the miracle cure. The belief in radium's healing power collapsed, replaced by a grim understanding of radiation sickness and long-term poisoning. The same element that had promised eternal vitality was revealed as a source of insidious decay. This bizarre and heartbreaking chapter stands as a stark warning, a reminder that our awe of new technology can blind us to its perils, and that the most seductive promises can sometimes hide the deadliest truths. From the deadly allure of radium to the wandering womb, our journey through these 25 forgotten beliefs reveals a universe of lost logic. Each one, from Miasma Theory to the divine right of kings, was once a pillar of common sense, a truth so obvious it needed no defense. They guided laws, shaped cities, dictated medical treatments, and sent explorers across uncharted oceans. They were not the fantasies of fools, but the best conclusions drawn from the available evidence, the stories a society told itself to make sense of a complex and terrifying world. And one by one, they all crumbled. This is the humbling lesson of history, that our most certain knowledge is provisional. The ground beneath our intellectual feet is not as solid as it feels. So what does that mean for us today with our advanced science and global connectivity? It invites a necessary and unsettling question. Which of our own deeply held convictions will our descendants look back on with the same mix of amusement and disbelief? Will it be our relentless pursuit of growth on a finite planet, our specific dietary dogmas, our current understanding of consciousness, or the fundamental nature of the universe? The very technologies we see as indispensable might one day appear as quaint and dangerous as a radium tonic. The point is not to dismiss our modern world, but to approach it with a little more humility and a lot more curiosity. We are not the final word in human understanding. We are merely another chapter in an ongoing story, one that future generations will continue to rewrite. The greatest absurdity of all would be to believe that we, uniquely in history, have finally figured everything out. So we turn this question over to you. What is the weirdest historical fact you have ever come across? And looking at our modern world, what belief or practice do you suspect will one day seem as bizarre to our descendants as trying a pig in a courtroom seems to us today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us continue this fascinating conversation about the strange, wonderful, and ever-changing story of what we think we know.